Ja, binnen. This is Mark Charles. Just a second. I'm moving to a different webcam. Our web microphone. I apologize for that. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is Friday, August 6th, and I am sitting down to drink my second cup of coffee. And I wanted to talk to you for just a few minutes about some of what's been going on in Congress, especially around the moratorium on evictions that has had a huge impact on people all across the country. But I want to talk about that a little bit and just touch on a few other topics. But before I do, as I always do, I want to just acknowledge I'm speaking to you from what's now known as Washington, D.C., and these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just publicly say how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So over the weekend, last weekend, as people knew, on Saturday, I believe it was, the moratorium, which had been issued to end eviction or to prevent evictions from happening, lapsed. And Joe Biden had delayed in getting a bill to Congress. And that meant when Congress got it very late last week, they only had, I think, only a day to do anything on it. And they weren't able to get anything passed, not surprisingly. And they were also running up against their August recess. And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, decided to send Congress on their vacation on Saturday, allowing the moratorium to lapse. That day, while most of the members of Congress were leaving and going home for their August vacation, their August recess, Cori Bush and others decided to stay in D.C. and they camped out right in front of the Capitol building. And they stayed there until there was some sort of movement on the evictions. And eventually the White House addressed it earlier this week. And now I believe an executive order has been issued by President Biden extending the moratorium on evictions. And there was some movement, some very positive movement. What's fascinating about this is on Sunday, I believe it was, either Saturday or Sunday, just after she sent Congress on their vacation, Nancy Pelosi tweeted, and she said the CDC has the power to extend the eviction moratorium. Let me make sure I'm reading this correctly. The CDC has the power to extend the eviction moratorium. As they double down on masks, why wouldn't they extend the moratorium in light of Delta variant? And this was a thread tweet, and she said, it is a moral imperative to keep people from being put out in the street, which also contributes to the public health emergency. The virus is still a threat. The moratorium must be extended, and the funds Congress allocated to assist renters and landlords must be spent. I'm going to actually share the link to that tweet in the comment section. This is the second tweet of the second tweet of the thread where she talks about a moral imperative. So a moral imperative is a strongly held principle that, and the way it was defined, is compels that person to act. I think moral imperative is mostly used in the first person. People do things because they have a moral imperative. Or they will say, they may declare it for others. There is a moral imperative that we do these things or that you do these things. But if you're going to use moral imperative in the third person, you really need to have a high amount of integrity. And what's fascinating is that Nancy Pelosi declared it was a moral imperative that the CDC do something when the courts had already determined it was Congress who needed to do something in order for this moratorium to be really, truly upheld. And yet the Biden administration delayed in getting something to Congress, and Congress, obviously, the way they're so partisan, could not pass anything. And so Nancy Pelosi sent them on their summer recess, their August recess, without doing anything, without even having meaningful debate about this, or requiring the members of Congress to stay and address this issue, which would have implications for millions of people across the country. Now, that was her prerogative, and she's allowed to do that. But then the next day, she now says it's a moral imperative. And you can't do that. You can't say that. If you refuse to act, even when the courts have told you you're the one responsible for acting, you cannot declare someone else who doesn't have the authority that you have, who doesn't have the power that you have. You can't say, well, it's now their moral imperative to do something about this issue. It doesn't work that way. But this is the challenge of how there is this massive lack of integrity among our leaders. And so what makes this so compelling, right, is that Cori Bush and others, they literally went to the Capitol building and they camped there. They camped out in front of the Capitol building for several days. There was an article in the Washington Post. It was titled, "Cori Bush slept outside the Capitol to protest evictions." And Democrats credited her for the renewed protections that were won. What's fascinating about this is it came out in the stories that 20 years ago, Cori Bush had been evicted herself from her housing and had needed to live in her car for a few weeks in order to have a place to sleep. And so that is the type of integrity that you need to have when you talk about a moral imperative. For reference, 20 years ago, Nancy Pelosi was in her 14th year serving in Congress, earning about $140,000 a year, right? During the recession, which had massive implications for most of the nation, Nancy Pelosi and many of these other congressional leaders who are now both in the Republican and the Democrat sides of the aisle, they were firmly ensconced, sitting in their seats in Congress, earning six-figure salaries, not experiencing the economic downturn of the Great Recession. Meanwhile, these newer members of Congress, like Cori Bush, literally were enduring things like evictions. And this is why Nancy Pelosi sent people on vacation, and why Cori Bush, among others, camped out in front of the Capitol and became homeless or acted as people without homes for a number of days in order to get some change happening. I think this lays out a really good argument for term limits, right? Most of our congressional leaders, even our nation's leaders, the majority of them are not only boomers, some of them are even from what they would call the greatest generation, right? These are people in their 70s and 80s, even I think there's even a few congressional leaders in their 90s. And they've been in Congress for decades. They've missed all of the economic downturn of the Great Recession. They missed all the economic downturn of even the pandemic. And they don't have the lived experience of the challenges that the American people have been facing, because they've had a stable income and stable housing and stable access to food and healthcare throughout this entire time. And so they don't act on these things with that sense of urgency that other leaders who have lived through these hardships have. And I think this is a great argument for term limits. Why we should not have people sitting in Congress for 30, 40 years at a time. Nancy Pelosi was first elected to Congress in 1987. She's been there for over 30 years now. And this is why we need to allow new voices and new faces and a more diverse demographic to take their seats at the table. Not only because they bring a different perspective, but because they bring an experience that actually gives them the authority to talk about moral imperatives and gives them the sense of urgency to actually make something happen. When you've been earning a six-figure salary for 30, 20, 30, 40 years, you've lived through all of the economic challenges our nation has faced, the globe has faced in the last 20, 30 years, and that it did not reduce your base salary. You lose a sense of urgency. You feel safe. You feel protected. And this is not a partisan issue. This is on the Republicans as well as the Democrats. Both of the leadership on both sides of the aisle are people who have been there for decades, literally for decades. And they're grasping, holding on to power. And I think we need to, this is a great argument for term limits. Anyway, I wanted to share some of these thoughts because as I kind of watched what happened over the last week, and I watched even with the solution they came up with, right, which was the executive order coming from the White House, which basically even President Biden has stated this is probably not going to work. The courts have already said that Congress needs to act. So Nancy Pelosi, instead of declaring that other people, other agencies have the moral imperative to do something that you don't have the courage or even the desire to do, either resign from office or do your job. But don't pass the buck. Don't say other people need to act when you do not have the courage to act yourself. And rather than applauding Cori Bush, next time I invite you to join her. Anyway, I hope my relatives that this is a helpful perspective for you. I'm actually going to be doing my my book study in about 15 minutes. I'm going to try and start it soon after 11. I'm trying something new this week because I want to. I've noticed in the weekend on Fridays, the further we get into the day, the less audience we have on some of these live streams. And so I'm actually going to try doing my second cups of coffee a bit earlier in the morning, maybe around 10 a.m. or 10:30 a.m. like I did this morning. And then try and do my weekly book studies around 11 or 11:30 so that we can try to catch people before they start kind of shutting down for the weekend. Something else that I'm excited about that's coming up next week. If you've heard me speak in the past, you know that I was honored to write the foreword for this book, The Land Is Not Empty by Sarah Augustine. And it came out about a month and a half ago. It's a fantastic book. I encourage people to read it. I was very honored to write the foreword for it. But next Tuesday, I'm going to have Sarah Augustine join me for my second cup of coffee. I'll bring her into the live stream, and she lives in Oregon, and we're going to have a discussion about her book and about her experience with the Doctrine of Discovery, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. So that will probably be sometime between 10 and 11 next week, Tuesday. I think we have it scheduled for 10:30, if I remember correctly. But anyway, so you'll want to join us for that next week. And again, around 11 this morning, between 11 and 11:15, I'm going to start my book study, and we'll be going through chapter 11, this time of Unsettling Truths. And this is about the trauma of the American story. And so we're going to be talking about the trauma that has come out of this history of the Doctrine of Discovery, this dehumanizing, violent, oppressive, genocidal history, and the way it has impacted not only communities of color, but even white Americans. So I hope you're able to join me for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining me this morning. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine. I actually have a new coffee. It's not new, but I've been drinking it more regularly recently. There's a Phil's Coffee, and they're a chain. I think they're all around the country. I believe I've even seen them in California. But I really like some of their roasts, and so we found a Phil's not too far from us here in DC, and I've been getting some Phil's coffee recently, so that's what I'm drinking this morning, and I really like this coffee. I was kind of excited when I was back in New Mexico with my parents about a week ago. My father gave me a gift of some coffee that was roasted and sold through a distributor on the Navajo Nation. And I was very excited to drink it and got home and realized it was decaf. And I'm not a huge decaf fan. So my daughter's been drinking it because she likes coffee, but we don't let her drink caffeinated coffee. So she's been drinking some of the decaf. But anyway, if I hope that you're able to join me for my book study later. I hope that you have a great day and walk in beauty, my relatives. And maybe we learn how to walk in beauty together. Ashahat and Hakonet.